After World War I ended, the demand for products fell flat. The gross national product declined by 10%. Since there wasn't high demand for products anymore, 5 million Americans lost their jobs. Many soldiers returning from war couldn't find employment anywhere. America had entered post-war recession. In this recession, over 100,000 businesses went bankrupt. Farmers were hit the hardest by falling prices. During the recession, over 453,000 farmers lost their land. The farmers were never able to fully recover from this hardship. Shortly lived, in the 1920s, consumers in the cities went on a huge shopping spree. That caused inflation, but the spree did not last. The recession could not be beat. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 is one of the antitrust acts by Theodore Roosevelt that gave factory workers and their unions a square deal that provided them protection from lawsuits, which was helpful since most of America saw them as untrustworthy. The public opinion turned against labor unions. The unions prospered during World War I, but things changed for the worst when America entered the post-war recession. The strikes of 1919 began in Seattle during the month of February. Over 60,000 union workers united with shipyard workers in a peaceful strike. The goal for said strike was to get better pay. Then in Boston around September, police officers went on strike against the firing of a few fellow officers who wanted to get unionized. The governor of Massachusetts called the National Guard to break up the strike. The U.S. Steel Corporation workers also went on strike in September. This strike was more violent than the others, so the state and federal troops were called in, and the strike was broken up in January of 1920.
By 1919, the racial climate had become savage and murderous. In the South, there was a sudden increase in lynchings. More than 70 African Americans died at the hands of white mobs in 1919 alone. In the North, black factory workers faced widespread job layoffs as returning white veterans came back from war and replaced them from their jobs. African American veterans found no such opportunities for their advancement. Rural black migrants to northern cities encountered white communities unfamiliar with and generally hostile to them. And as whites became convinced that black workers with lower wage demands were hurting them economically, animosity grew rapidly. In Chicago, a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan happened to drift toward a white beach. The whites on shore allegedly stoned him unconscious, thus drowning him. Angry African Americans gathered in crowds and marched into white neighborhoods to retaliate. Whites formed an even larger crowd and performed very violent acts, leading Chicago to be in an all-out war for more than a week. These were known as the Chicago Race Riots. Developed in 1919 after World War I, the Red Scare was the fear of the spread of communism in the United States. Many historians maintain that Americans were not just opposed to the ideas of communism, but they began to see everything wrong in American society as a creation of the Reds. In the spring of 1919, there was a series of bombings that caused national alarm and resulted in the death of 30 people. This made the middle-class Americans stand up and fight against radicalism, producing popular anti-radicalism. The belief of anti-radicalism reinforced the Protestant idea of 100% Americanism. The radical threat was exposed and protested especially through the Philadelphia Inquirer. The greatest contribution to the Red Scare was when Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover organized raids on radical centers and arrested more than 6,000 people. The Palmer raids in 1919 and 1920 were originally intended to uncover huge caches of weapons and explosives. They consisted of arresting thousands of Americans, many of whom were released. Hundreds of those not born in the United States were sent back to their countries of origin. Today, many view the raids as a gross violation of constitutional rights of American citizens. Two Italian immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were charged with murder of a paymaster in May of 1920. The evidence against them includes how both men were confessed anarchists, for which they faced a widespread public presumption of guilt. They were then convicted in a trial and sentenced to death by Judge Webster Thayer. The two men continued to Pro 23rd, 1927, when they died in electric chairs. Catherine Ann Porter labeled the case the never-ending wrong and made sure that this bitter legacy of the Red Scare was never forgotten by Americans.
And I'm proud to be an American.